Hi, here's Z.A.P.Y speaking. This is our Canadian long weekend of Victoria Day, and this will be the first long weekend we try to reopen up slowly here in Canada. We have a different phase. But our neighbor down in US, they have a different take of how to open, and people don't really agree with each other. But let's listen to what the expert here, Dr. Fauci says about how and should even American try to reopen, and let's learn how he convey his message.
Yeah, so one thing before we get into it, there are four things we're really going to look at today, which are emphasis by enunciation, which I believe we've talked about before. We're also going to mention how to transition between ideas with tone, which is something that Dr. Fauci does once or twice in there, and it's a pretty good way of moving between ideas. We're going to look at word choice and the importance of maintaining or changing a word that we use. And lastly, we'll look at consonants / assonants and how we can use repeated sounds. So let's jump into it. Let's see how Dr. Fauci uses these things to convey a message.
Okay, let's go to our first example of this video.
Worked out is a guideline framework of how to safely open America again. And there are several checkpoints in that.
So that was just a super short start. And what we're looking at here, there's two things. One is something that he does well, and there's actually one thing I would hope that he would change in the future. But we'll start with the thing he did well. So he says the words guideline framework, but he says them differently than everything else. He said everything else he speaks fairly quickly. Well, not quickly. He's a very slow speaking person, which is great for information communication, but he's speaking at one speed. But when he says guideline framework, he slows down. His mouth actually gets wider when he's enunciating. Guideline framework, and he's making it stand out, which is a great way of drawing our attention to it and knowing that this is the most important point in his sentence. Now, the thing I'd encourage him to do a little bit differently here, and this is a challenge with cameras and computers, is he's looking at the face of the person speaking on his screen. Or maybe he's looking at a script, I'm not sure. He's not looking at us as his audience. So we need to look at the camera when we're speaking on a computer. A great example of this, right now I'm looking at the camera, it looks like I'm making beautiful eye contact, we can build a connection this way, but now I'm looking at Yangfan's face. And all of a sudden, you get a really front row view to my massive forehead. Well, I'm staring at Yangfan, but Yangfan doesn't feel like I'm looking at him. No one else does, so I look at the camera, and that way we engage a lot more. So I'd love to see him look at the camera more while he's using that excellent emphasis to make the ideas stand out and to have a bit more connectivity while he's making those ideas stand out.
Yeah, it is a bit weird when you talk with people through the camera. I believe in the acting world, they have a word called a camera sense. Basically, you know where the camera is, and you speak to the camera as if you speak to a real person. It is odd, but then yeah, it's something we can practice, especially in this new era. I think it's just more and more common to speak through a camera now.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue is everyone's far too polite when it comes to cameras. We want to look at people in the eye because that's what we've been taught. Look someone in the eye, it's respectful. Right now I'm looking Yangfan in the eye, but it feels like I'm ignoring him. So we should be looking at the camera, you're right. So that's my bit on that one.
Yeah, and I feel like Dr. Fauci here can make his framework of this whole speech clear. He basically speaks in the usual tone he has. To be honest, I didn't really catch he laid things out at this beginning of the interview. For me, just like it goes right in. So that's maybe something. So back to the other point we're making in the video is scientists don't really train of how to communicate as a crazy speaker or as a comedian. So therefore, this a little tactic can be ignored.
Yeah, and it's that issue of information versus engagement, and sometimes they do play opposite, or they work against each other. So it's something that's very difficult to overcome.
Yeah, something we will try to balance. Yeah. But Dr. Fauci do have some good example, and the next part of the clip we'll be showing some nice example here. So let's go into that.
That would really determine the speed and the pace with which one does re-enter or reopen. So my word has been, and I've been very consistent in this, that I get concerned if you have a situation where the dynamics of an outbreak in an area are such that you are not seeing that gradual over 14-day decrease that would allow you to go to phase 1. And then if you pass the checkpoints of phase 1, go to phase 2 and phase 3. What I've expressed.
Okay, one thing, I mentioned this idea of transitioning with tone here. And we see Dr. Fauci speaking in two very different ways here. At the beginning, he's speaking slowly because he's giving an explanation. He's talking about how much these states or these different groups will roll out their preventative measures and how fast they can do things. It's still an explanation, so he's speaking slowly. But as soon as he starts talking about his own opinion, he actually picks up his speed of speaking. And it's not even necessarily that he says the words faster. There's just less space in between the words. He pauses less, and that makes things go faster. So he's moved on to a different part of what he's saying. And in order to let us know that this is a new portion, and whether he does this intentionally or not, I don't know, but to let us know that he's moving on to this new part, he picks up his speed. So before, during explanation, he goes slowly, big pauses, and then when he comes back to his opinion, he starts speaking faster. I've been very consistent with this, or I guess not even his opinion really. It's his past track record, where he's no longer explaining the model to us. He's telling us about what he's done. So he moves a lot faster, and that tells us, subconsciously or consciously, that we've moved on to a new point. And he still does maintain that great emphasis through enunciation I mentioned before.
Yeah, I really like this part of his speech. That's what caught my attention the first time, is that I noticed in the pause, and that's a really, really long pause actually for his speaking style. Then he used this kind of really classic teacher tactic of explain ideas. Throughout a big term, take pause, and then explain it. But in here, he used a faster speed of speaking to emphasize what is important here. He said, I've been consistent at, we need to check, and check. Be really careful, be really consistent, be precautious about how we open up. And that is his key message throughout. I mean, for these few months now, and here he just honed in the information once again. So that way of speaking really get it through.
Yeah, and just that energy variation also keeps us more engaged as well, which is really nice.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he does that is something he does well.
Yeah, I believe he probably teach quite a bit in his younger age.
Well,
as a
doctor, it's very possible, especially in his position, that even if he's not teaching as a professor or a teacher like I am, he's definitely educating people a lot. So if he was working with a patient, he has to educate them on stuff. So he does do an excellent job of educational things.
Yeah. Okay. And let's go to the next part. So the next clip, we are looking at the repetition of the word.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably where the listener can pay attention to how he say it.
Mm-hmm.
Various checkpoints and prematurely open up without having the capability of being able to respond effectively and efficiently. My concern is that we will start to see little spikes that might turn into outbreaks. So therefore, I have been being very clear.
So, and when we talk about repetition of words that Young Fun was mentioning, he used the word checkpoints in actually the previous chunk we listened to, from the 50 seconds to a minute 20, roughly, whatever we did there. He uses the word checkpoints repeatedly. He's repeating the word, and this is for an educational purpose. He's using the same word, so we know we're talking about the same thing. He could use different words. He could say checkpoints. He could say milestones. He could say, I don't know, benchmarks or whatever, but he's throwing out the same word each time because he wants us to know we're talking about the same thing every time. If we change our word choice here, we could end up with a confused audience, or people thinking, oh, are these different things? But instead we're super consistent. It's very easy for us to know we're still talking about the checkpoints. We're still talking about the checkpoints. We're still talking about the checkpoints, because he's repeating them each time. And I'm pretty sure he only changes his word preference for checkpoints once. And I think that came a little earlier, but I'm not totally sure. But he's very consistent with his word choice, which is important because it engages, it makes sure that we know what we're talking about. There's one other thing I would like to see him change here. And it was right about this point when I first watched this video, I noticed that his hands haven't moved once. He's got his hands kind of down low with just his thumb poking up occasionally. His shoulders don't move. His facial expression doesn't change a lot. He does change his facial expression occasionally in that he bobs his head every once in a while for that emphasis, which is great. So using our body to add emphasis as well is really important, because if I point and I lean in, it makes something more emphatic than if I just change my voice. But his hands have stayed still. His shoulders have stayed the same. And if we're educating people, it really helps to add a visual element, something people can look at, right? So if I'm showing the size of something, I show the size of it with my hands. I don't just say, oh, it was, if I say it was a meter or 3 feet or whatever in size, I say it was this big, I say it was this big, I say it was this big, because then it helps someone to actually see it and imagine it. So I would recommend he actually use his hands a little more. So you can say something like, for each checkpoint, and then we have an idea if these are different positions that we're getting cut into. So I'd recommend he use his hands more, but I do like his repetition of words. I like his bounce of the head for emphasis, but a few more hand gestures, even shoulder movement and facial expressions would go a long way, I think, in once again, enhancing the education.
This part of speech from Dr. Fauci come across a little bit plain as a simple idea and simple word choice. It was so simple that there's no even much body movement. I do not know if he does that on purpose or it's just a simple thing he wants to emphasize. He doesn't want to have too much distraction of hand gesture and shoulder movement. This part I'm not quite sure. Just for my personal feeling here, I get this idea of keep checking in again and again. So he does convey that message quite well. Mm-hmm. So that's maybe a personality of a scientist or someone keep making this science policy decision here. He's kind of very, very serious. I'm just saying the exact word because every word he says carry quite a bit of weight.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess, yeah, you are right. It's a little plain is the word you used. He's not committing as much information across. Then again, you do want variations in the amount of information you want sent across, because if you just constantly have information flying across, it could overwhelm people. Although I do tend to think still some gestures would still be nice. So even if he is trying to keep it simple, I talk with my hands a lot. So you don't have to do what I do where I'm constantly just like flailing. But you do want at least a certain level of engagement visually for an audience. That's what I think, at least.
Yeah, I mean, some speakers use their hand a lot, like the Donald Trump. Yeah, Aaron here too. I'm not saying Aaron is saying as Donald Trump, just saying.
I'm a little different.
Some speaker, yeah, it's quite different.
I would argue quite different, but
yeah, quite different.
It's in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, well, okay. So it could come down to personal choice and personality and people's background of education. So that's very subtle things. And talk about education background. Dr. Fauci is a scientist, and we all know this profession is really careful about word choice. So the next example we will show is how he carefully turned the words from the reporter to his choice of words. And that one word difference is carry different kind of emphasis of how he see the current situation is. Let's move on to that bit.
Dire, correct?
The consequences could be really serious, particularly, and this is something that I think we also should pay attention to, that states, even if they're doing it at an appropriate pace.
Okay, so here, in case you didn't hear what the reporters say clearly, the reporters say it's a very dire situation. And Dr. Fauci take the question and turn it around and say, okay, it's a serious situation. So he changed the word dire to serious. And there's a subtle difference. Let Aaron explain the difference here.
Yeah, so the senator, reporter, whoever says dire, he says really serious. And there's a number of reasons he might have done that. One, he might just prefer the word. He might just like the word serious more. Another is that he may see serious and dire as on different levels. So to me, personally, I think dire is worse than serious. If I'm in a serious situation, it's bad. But if I'm in a dire situation, I'm probably about to get hit by a truck or something. So I tend to think that there's a level of severity there that's different. I'm very curious about it, and I do think that his wording, like we say, seems less severe. And I'm curious why he did that. I almost want to hear him address that in what he's saying something like, well, maybe not dire, but more serious. Or if he does want to go with the same severity, I probably would have thought that he would go with the same word. And that once again comes back to that idea of repeating words to send the same message. If he says it's serious, she says it's dire, people take different things from those two words. And if he is trying to do something different, fair enough. I personally would have liked an explanation as to why he chose a different word. But if it's just word choice, if it's just preference, I think he should go with the same one. That's just me, though. I focus a lot on individual words and the meaning that they add to a situation.
Yeah, I think he think about this word because I remember there's a tiny little pause right after it. If we just play this little piece again. So now I think one point Aaron raised is really important. Maybe he's better at addressing the key point rather than just changing the words. And people say, oh, well, are you trying to downplay the situation? And I think he was pausing. Let's go have a check.
Dire, correct?
The consequences could be really serious.
Right. So he is changing the words because he was saying the consequence is really serious. So when he's saying those, he's searching for the right word. It's really clear. I would say it's quite clear for me. He doesn't agree the word choice of dire from the reporter is saying, which is fair. He has probably a lot of information going on, talk to an expert. So therefore, in this situation, particularly as a scientific communication in this sense, scientists better address heads-on and say why Dr. Fauci thinks this is not a dire situation. Instead, there's a serious situation, and explain this subtle difference. Otherwise, people will say, okay, is he trying to downplay this, therefore allow the administration to reopen, or is this a really safe choice for us to reopen? And that's where the scientific communication really comes in these subtleties. That's a difficulty as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I tend to think that, well, if you are going to change a word for that effect, you need to have the explanation in there. And it is just, to be fair, it is possible we're reading way too much into this, and he was just searching for the word because he's like, I need a word for something that's bad, serious, right? It's possibly had that moment.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it seems like it was a very unusual thing to change. But either way, word choice is important.
Word choice is important. And Dr. Fauci, at the end of this interview, did a beautiful word of choice, bring the message home. And that's not how he did.
You will see some cases appear. It's the ability and the capability of responding to those cases with good identification.
I like those words, ability and capability. They mean roughly the same thing in a lot of ways. But by saying words that have similar sounds, I believe it's consonance. I was trying to decide earlier whether it was assonance or consonance because I can't fully remember the difference, and Googling it didn't really clarify much for me. But I think it's consonance, where it's that repeated consonant sounds in a phrase that make it much more appealing to the ear. He could have just said, oh, it's the capability, and that would have been fine on its own. But by saying the ability and the capability, it sounds much more sophisticated, much more complex, but it also has a really pleasing tone to it because of that repetition of sound. It's a little bit like rhyming, but if he said this whole thing in rhyme, I think people would have been
that would go viral.
Actually, that would have been amazing. He could have rapped it. That would have been awesome. But I mean, what else are you gonna do in quarantine, right? You gotta pass the time somehow. May as well write raps. But
Yeah, Dr. Fauci just went quarantine last week, I think.
yeah, well, he's got another week to write his next presentation as a rap then. But that repetition of sound is it's really pleasing to the ear. It's like using alliteration. It's like using sometimes rhyme can be used with parallelism, which we discussed before. Any kind of repetition is not just repetition, but any kind of rhythm or rhyme that we can add that's not super obvious as if it is a rap, but just makes something slightly more pleasing to the ear is going to engage people a little bit more because it's going to sound more interesting. It's a little bit like having a bit of Dr. Seuss in there. It's just ear catching. It's fun, right? And I know he's not aiming for fun, and that's not the point, but the sound of it, it makes a more pleasing sound. And because of that, we are more likely to listen and engage with it, I think. But.
Yeah, in this situation, it's more important to listen, really, really listen of what the expert says. And in this regard, I'm really happy about what Canada is doing. Most of this regulation and decision making are leading by the front line, the doctors. They are making the call on politicians. They know their place, they're taking the back seat. And one amazing small fact, is they're mostly women. Canadian women make great decision. Yeah, just look up the speaker for BC here is is a lady, and there's a whole bunch of other provinces. They might be from the same class. I don't know. They look similar age.
Yeah, I don't know. Like the one for BC is Bonnie Henry, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as I think she's done a good job with it. But yeah, you're right. It's important to defer to experts in these cases. But I think it's also something where it's also up to those experts to communicate in a way that is good to listen to. Because I know sometimes I hear experts speak, and it's very clear that their expertise is in a specific field and not in communication or speaking or education. And I mean, their job hasn't been necessarily up until this point to be communicators. So all of a sudden it's thrust upon them. But it is a really important skill, especially if you're taking on that role. If you're going to present something, you need your audience, even if they don't enjoy it, you want them to pay attention to it.
Totally.
Right? And there are key things that we need to do to make something palatable to someone's ear, right? Like we were talking about earlier, there's there's videos of people communicating financial information about COVID. And oh my God, I couldn't listen for more than a minute or two before it just I just couldn't understand. I realized about halfway through that I hadn't been listening because there was no engagement, no effort to engage the audience. It's just about here's information, which is what textbooks do, and which is why I never read textbooks in university.
Yeah, maybe we will cover that video, and if so, I will put a link down below or put a card on the videotape. And there is a textbook example of bad speech.
Good content, bad delivery. Yes.
Good content, bad delivery. Yeah, it's very, very dense financial content, but the delivery, it is horrible.
Well, and I think delivery in terms of speaking has a higher minimum. If you don't have the delivery skills, it doesn't matter how good your content is, you're going to have a tough time engaging people, which is why you can have the dumbest topic ever and someone can still deliver it in a way that's really amusing, hence half of all comedians. Whereas you can also have some like that killer content without the delivery is boring, right?
Yeah.
And that when I say the thing about comedians, a lot of comedians do have great content, but they'll tell what is objectively a stupid story, but they tell it in a way that makes everybody laugh. So their content, although it is often top notch, it doesn't have to be because it's about the delivery of it, right? So
totally.
That I'm being unfair to comedians, but either way.
No, it's okay. I would say there's a two spectrum here, and one of purpose we show Dr. Fauci's videotape here because he is expert himself. And his delivery, to be fair, is really, really good as a scientific expert. It's not the same caliber as those comedian, but comedian don't know the information he knows. So therefore, I think Dr. Fauci is a good balance of these two worlds and
Yeah.
to get good
And
information
I think,
out.
and something Dr. Fauci does that we talked about before in a previous video was transmitting information with confidence. And he manages to sound like he really believes what he's saying, and he builds credibility with what he says without, I think, without destroying the integrity of the information.
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing to do, but I think he does it well.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And we have this kind of video discussion in our YouTube channel. We have a playlist. So please go to that. And I believe the title is called Confidence, the Importance of Confidence in Delivery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the truth versus right, why expert didn't talk with confidence.
Yeah.
So this is in-depth analysis we did about how scientific communication come about, how this expert need to up their game, basically. I would say this may be a nice wrap for this Dr. Fauci's video section. So in the end, we would like just to give a few pointer of summary here. I don't know if everyone will have a go with it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the things we covered, and the main things we covered, were the importance of emphasis by enunciation and through other elements like bobbing our head and things like that, and how Dr. Fauci made things stand out just by the way he used his words. He also transitioned by using the tone of his voice really well, so he sped up at times to show us we're moving on to a new idea. His word choice, although his word choice was interesting, so sometimes he repeated words really well, like checkpoint, he said that over and over. And other times when he chose a different word, I questioned it. And I think word choice is really important. And then the last thing we mentioned was we talked about repeating sounds, so assonance or the use of rhetorical and literature devices, I can't remember the word, that makes something more compelling to listen to just because it makes it sound more aesthetically pleasing to the ear. The other thing we talked about that I didn't mention at the beginning was a couple little things about using our hands and about looking at the camera, which were things I would really like to see Fauci do more of to make his speaking a little bit more engaging for everyone.
Great. With most of the country now is open, is phase of reopening. I hope we can all learn something from this Dr. Fauci speaking and still be really careful and stay safe. For Canadians, we are opening the lab, and on this long weekend, I hope every Canadians have fun, stay safe, and our American neighbors listen to Dr. Fauci. He's pretty good. Listen to him. And that's the episode of Z.A.P.Y Speaking on Dr. Fauci's opinion on his speech of reopening. I hope you like it, and see you next time.
See you next time.